What if a man could rob an airplane, jump into a thunderstorm at 10,000 feet, and simply cease to exist? No wreckage, no parachute found tangled in the trees, no body ever recovered. It sounds impossible. Yet on the night of November 24th, 1971, a calm, well-dressed passenger did exactly that, stepping out of a Boeing 727 somewhere above the dark forests of the Pacific Northwest with $200,000 strapped to his body. He was never seen again. Federal agents would spend the next 5 decades chasing his shadow. And to this day, nobody, not the FBI, not historians, not even his own family, if he had one, knows his real name.
The man called himself Dan Cooper when he purchased his ticket, and a clerical error during early news reporting would forever brand him with the name history remembers, D.B. Cooper. He boarded Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 in Portland, Oregon, bound for Seattle, wearing a neat black suit, a white shirt, a thin black tie, and dark sunglasses. He looked, by every account, like an unremarkable businessman heading home from a long day. Nothing about him drew attention. That, it would turn out, was precisely the point. Within an hour, this quiet, ordinary-looking man would pull off the only unsolved skyjacking in American aviation history. To understand how something this audacious was even possible, you have to remember what commercial air travel looked like in 1971. There were no metal detectors, no X-ray machines scanning carry-on bags, no government watch lists cross-checking passenger names. Anyone with cash could buy a ticket under any name they chose and walk directly onto a plane, carrying whatever they wished in a briefcase. Air travel was built on trust, glamour, and convenience, not security. It was, unknowingly, the perfect environment for a criminal who understood exactly how to exploit a system that had never once considered someone might try what Cooper was about to attempt. Shortly after takeoff, Cooper calmly handed a note to flight attendant Florence Schaffner, who assumed, as many young women did in that era, that the quiet man in seat 18C was simply passing along his phone number. She slipped it into her purse without reading it. Cooper leaned toward her and said something that changed everything. "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." Schaffner opened it and read a message written in neat, deliberate block letters, demanding that she sit beside him immediately. Her heart pounding, she complied, and the ordinary flight from Portland to Seattle silently transformed into a hostage situation. Cooper opened his briefcase just enough to reveal what appeared to be a bundle of red cylinders wired together, along with a battery and a tangle of wires, an object that looked convincingly exactly like a homemade bomb. Whether it was real or an elaborate bluff remains unknown to this day. What mattered in that moment was that everyone on board believed it. Cooper's demands were shockingly specific and remarkably calm for a man threatening mass destruction. He wanted $200,000 in unmarked $20 bills, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck waiting once the plane landed in Seattle. Then he simply sat back and waited. What followed was one of the most surreal negotiations in aviation history, conducted almost entirely through radio communication between the cockpit and authorities on the ground. Northwest Orient's president personally authorized the ransom payment, terrified of what might happen to the 36 passengers and crew still trapped inside the aircraft circling above Seattle. FBI agents scrambled to assemble the exact demands, 200 bills, each carefully photographed and recorded by serial number before being loaded into a bag. Cooper, meanwhile, remained eerily polite throughout the ordeal, ordering a bourbon and soda from the flight attendants, tipping generously, and behaving less like a criminal than a man completing an unusual business transaction. After nearly 2 hours of circling, the plane finally landed at Seattle-Tacoma Airport just after 5 in the evening. Cooper allowed the passengers to disembark once his money and parachutes were delivered, keeping only the flight crew aboard. Watching from the tarmac, FBI agents studied him through binoculars, searching desperately for any identifying detail. Those specific flight conditions revealed something crucial.
Cooper wasn't simply demanding an escape. He was planning something far more audacious. A low-altitude, unpressurized cabin and a specific airspeed weren't arbitrary requests. They were the precise technical conditions required to safely open an aircraft door mid-flight and jump out alive. As the Boeing 727 climbed back into the darkening sky, carrying only Cooper and a skeleton flight crew locked safely in the cockpit, authorities on the ground began to suspect the unthinkable. This wasn't just a hijacking anymore. It was about to become the most audacious escape attempt in the history of American crime.
Somewhere over the dense, rain-soaked forests of southwestern Washington, at roughly 8 o'clock that night, the cockpit crew noticed a warning light indicating the aft stairway door had been opened mid-flight. The plane shuddered slightly from the sudden change in air pressure. When the crew radioed back to check on their passenger, there was no response. Cooper was gone. He had walked to the rear stairway of the aircraft, lowered it into the roaring, freezing night air, strapped on a parachute, and stepped out into a raging thunderstorm somewhere above one of the most remote, densely forested regions in the entire continental United States.
Think about the sheer audacity of that moment. It was pitch dark. Rain lashed sideways in furious gusts. The temperature at altitude hovered near freezing. Cooper wore only a business suit, a thin raincoat, and loafers. Hardly the equipment of an experienced skydiver prepared for a wilderness landing. He carried the money strapped to his body in a money bag, along with a parachute he had personally inspected but never tested. No one knows exactly where he landed, whether his parachute even opened correctly, or whether he survived the jump at all. In that instant, D.B. Cooper became either a criminal mastermind or a corpse in the wilderness. The plane landed safely in Reno, Nevada, carrying a stunned flight crew who had witnessed a stranger vanish from 3,500 feet into a storm without a single word of farewell. Investigators swarmed the aircraft immediately, searching for fingerprints, hair, fibers, anything that might identify their vanished hijacker. They found a black tie left behind on his seat, along with a mother-of-pearl clip, small physical traces of a man who had otherwise left almost no evidence of his true identity. As dawn broke the following morning, the FBI launched what would become one of the largest, longest, and most expensive manhunts in American criminal history. Agents faced an almost impossible task. Cooper had jumped somewhere over an enormous, densely forested wilderness spanning parts of southwestern Washington, an area riddled with steep ravines, freezing rivers, and forests so thick that search teams on the ground struggled simply to move in a straight line. Helicopters scanned the treetops. Search dogs combed the underbrush. Soldiers from a nearby military base joined civilian volunteers scouring the terrain for weeks. They found nothing. No parachute, no money bag, no shoe print, no scrap of fabric. It was as though the forest itself had absorbed him completely, refusing to surrender a single clue about his fate. As weeks turned into months, the search expanded to include rivers, lakes, and remote logging roads scattered across the region. The FBI compiled a list of over 800 suspects, ordinary men whose physical description loosely matched witness accounts. Mid-40s, medium build, calm demeanor, and an apparent familiarity with aircraft. Each lead eventually collapsed under scrutiny. No fingerprint matched, no confession held up, no recovered item connected definitively to the case. The man who had walked so calmly onto Flight 305 seemed to have planned his disappearance as meticulously as his crime, leaving investigators chasing a ghost through some of the most unforgiving terrain in America. Witnesses aboard the flight provided investigators with their only real window into Cooper's personality, and the details painted a strange, contradictory portrait. He was polite to flight attendants, even concerned about their safety during the tense negotiation. He seemed calm rather than desperate, methodical rather than panicked. He mentioned, almost casually, that he had no personal grudge against the airline. Flight attendant Tina Mucklow, who spent the most time near him during the ordeal, later described him as courteous, almost gentle,
someone who behaved less like a violent criminal and more like a man executing a carefully rehearsed plan he had lived with for a very long time.
That calm confidence became one of the most debated clues in the entire case. Cooper's precise knowledge of the Boeing 727's rear stairway, a design feature relatively obscure to the general public at the time, suggested genuine aviation experience. His specific altitude and airspeed demands matched exactly the conditions required for a survivable jump. Some investigators theorized he might have been a former paratrooper, possibly with military training from the Korean War or Vietnam era. Others suspected he could have worked in the aviation industry itself, perhaps as a mechanic or cargo loader with insider knowledge of exactly how commercial aircraft functioned and precisely how to exploit their vulnerabilities.
And yet, for all his apparent expertise, Cooper made choices that seemed strangely reckless for someone so meticulous. He jumped at night into a violent storm over unfamiliar mountainous terrain, wearing dress shoes rather than boots, without a helmet, and using a parachute he hadn't personally packed or tested beforehand. Some investigators began to suspect that Cooper wasn't actually an experienced skydiver at all, but rather someone with just enough technical knowledge to sound convincing, banking everything on a desperate gamble rather than genuine expertise. If that theory holds true, it's entirely possible Cooper never survived his own escape plan, killed by the very jump meant to secure his freedom. For years, that grim possibility that Cooper had died instantly upon impact somewhere in the wilderness remained the leading theory among investigators. The terrain below his likely jump zone included dense forest, steep ravines, and the icy, fast-moving waters of the Columbia River. A parachute malfunction, a broken neck from a violent tree landing, or simple hypothermia in soaking wet clothing during a freezing November night could easily have ended his life within hours of his daring escape. If Cooper had died on impact, his money bag and remains might still be hidden somewhere in that vast wilderness, decomposed and forgotten, his true identity buried forever alongside $200,000 in cash. Then, in February of 1980, nearly 9 years after Cooper's disappearance, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram made a discovery that reignited the entire case. While digging in the sandy riverbank along the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington, during a family picnic, he uncovered 3 decaying bundles of cash, partially disintegrated, but still bearing recognizable serial numbers. FBI forensic teams confirmed almost immediately this was Cooper's ransom money, nearly $6,000 of it, buried in the sand exactly where the churning river had apparently deposited it years earlier. For the first time in nearly a decade, investigators finally had physical proof connecting directly back to the crime. The discovery raised as many questions as it answered. If the money had washed downstream and settled into that particular sandbar, it suggested Cooper's landing zone might have been considerably farther north and east than investigators had originally assumed, closer to where the Columbia River curved through remote wilderness rather than the area search teams had exhaustively combed for years. But the bundled bills also raised a chilling possibility. Money doesn't typically stay neatly bundled together if a living person carries it away and spends it gradually. The fact that it remained wrapped together suggested it may have simply been abandoned, lost, or buried, rather than carried off by a surviving hijacker. This single discovery split investigators and amateur researchers into 2 camps that persist even today. One group believes the money's location proves Cooper died during or shortly after his jump, his body and the majority of his cash lost somewhere upstream, with only a fraction eventually washing down to that riverbank. The other camp argues that Cooper deliberately buried a portion of his money himself, perhaps to dispose of marked bills too risky to spend, while successfully escaping with the remainder to build a quiet, anonymous new life somewhere far from the investigation. Both theories remain entirely plausible, and neither has ever been definitively proven or disproven. Beyond the physical evidence, the D.B. Cooper case produced an extraordinary parade of suspects and confessions, some serious, others almost comically implausible.
Over the decades, deathbed confessions surfaced from at least half a dozen men, each insisting they were the true hijacker, each ultimately failing to provide verifiable proof. Family members frequently came forward after a relative's death, convinced that an uncle, father, or brother's mysterious past, unexplained wealth, or sudden disappearance around 1971 matched the case perfectly. The FBI investigated each credible lead thoroughly. Time and again, forensic evidence, fingerprints, or simple timeline inconsistencies eliminated the suspect, returning the case to its original frustrating blank slate.
Among the most compelling suspects was a man named Richard Floyd McCoy Jr., a former Army helicopter pilot and Sunday school teacher, who remarkably hijacked a nearly identical flight just 5 months after Cooper's disappearance, demanding cash and a parachute before jumping from the aircraft himself. McCoy was captured within days, and some investigators noted striking similarities in his methods, technical knowledge, and physical build compared to witness descriptions of Cooper. However, key details didn't match. Witnesses who saw Cooper up close during the original hijacking insisted McCoy looked noticeably different, and McCoy was serving time in prison during a period that seemingly ruled him out of later Cooper-related developments.
Another prominent suspect, Kenneth Christensen, was a former paratrooper and Northwest Orient Airlines employee whose brother, after Kenneth's death, became convinced his sibling had been D.B. Cooper. Christensen possessed genuine parachuting experience, worked directly for the very airline Cooper had hijacked, and reportedly exhibited unexplained wealth in the years following 1971. Investigators found the theory intriguing enough to pursue seriously, examining Christensen's known movements, financial records, and physical resemblance to composite sketches. Yet, as with every other suspect before him, definitive proof never materialized. No confirmed fingerprint match, no conclusive DNA connection, just another tantalizing possibility added to an already overflowing list of maybes. Perhaps the most famous suspect remains Dwayne Weber, whose wife came forward decades after his 1995 death, revealing that he had confessed to being D.B. Cooper on his deathbed, whispering, "I'm Dan Cooper," moments before he passed away. Weber had a documented criminal history, matched physical descriptions reasonably well, and had reportedly visited the exact area along the Columbia River where the money was later discovered, years before that public discovery was ever made. For years, Weber's case seemed among the strongest, but DNA testing conducted on partial genetic material recovered from Cooper's discarded tie ultimately failed to match Weber's own DNA, seemingly eliminating him as a serious candidate. That tie itself, left behind on Cooper's airline seat during the original hijacking, became one of the investigation's most valuable and enduring pieces of physical evidence. Decades after the crime, forensic scientists extracted partial DNA samples from the fabric, along with microscopic particulate traces under an electron microscope. Remarkably, researchers discovered rare metal particles embedded in the tie's fibers, including titanium and specific alloys used almost exclusively in aerospace and metallurgical manufacturing during the early 1970s. This suggested Cooper may have worked in or around the aerospace industry, an area with deep historical roots in the very region surrounding Seattle, home to Boeing's massive manufacturing operations. This aerospace connection opened an entirely new investigative direction. Boeing employed tens of thousands of workers throughout the greater Seattle area during the early 1970s, many with direct access to sensitive manufacturing facilities, technical aircraft knowledge, and the exact kind of specialized metal particles later found on Cooper's tie. Could Cooper have been a disgruntled engineer, a laid-off contractor, or a manufacturing employee with intimate insider knowledge of exactly how a Boeing 727 functioned? The timing seemed significant, too. Boeing had recently undergone massive layoffs in the surrounding region, leaving thousands of skilled, technically knowledgeable workers suddenly unemployed, financially desperate, and potentially resentful toward the very industry that had abandoned them. Amateur investigators, sometimes calling themselves Cooperites, have spent decades independently pursuing leads the FBI either dismissed or never fully explored.
These dedicated researchers have combed through flight manifests, interviewed elderly witnesses, analyzed weather patterns from that stormy November night, and even organized their own wilderness search expeditions along the suspected jump corridor. Their collective efforts, shared across internet forums and dedicated research communities, have uncovered genuinely valuable insights that professional investigators sometimes overlooked. In many ways, the D.B. Cooper case became one of America's first great collaborative true crime mysteries, decades before podcasts and true crime documentaries turned amateur investigation into a mainstream cultural phenomenon. The FBI itself remained committed to the case for an astonishing 45 years, reviewing thousands of tips, testing physical evidence with increasingly advanced forensic technology, and periodically reopening promising leads as new suspects emerged. Agents pursued handwriting analysis on Cooper's original ransom notes, comparing his distinctive block letter style against hundreds of suspects. They analyzed his known vocabulary and phrasing for regional dialect clues. They even studied his apparent familiarity with Pacific Northwest geography, since his flight path demands suggested detailed personal knowledge of the specific terrain below. Despite this extraordinary, sustained investigative effort, the case file grew thicker every year, while the fundamental mystery remained entirely, stubbornly unsolved. In July of 2016, the FBI made an announcement that shocked and disappointed devoted followers of the case. After 45 years, they were formally suspending active investigation into the D.B. Cooper hijacking. Citing the need to redirect resources toward more solvable, pressing priorities, the Bureau explained that without new, verifiable physical evidence, continuing to actively investigate had become an inefficient use of limited resources. It was a rare and remarkable admission. America's premier federal law enforcement agency, after deploying enormous resources across nearly 5 decades, was officially conceding defeat against a single, anonymous hijacker who had vanished into a storm one November evening. That announcement, rather than closing the case emotionally for the American public, only intensified fascination surrounding it. If the FBI itself couldn't solve it, what did that say about Cooper's planning, his luck, or perhaps simply the wilderness itself, vast and unforgiving enough to permanently swallow both a man and his secrets? Books, documentaries, and dedicated research organizations continued their independent investigations even after the FBI officially stepped back. The case had transformed from an active federal manhunt into something closer to American folklore, a genuine unsolved mystery that refused to fade, regardless of official conclusions or the passage of nearly half a century. Part of what makes the Cooper case so uniquely compelling is the strange cultural affection many Americans developed for their mysterious hijacker. Unlike most criminals, Cooper harmed no one physically. He threatened violence, but never actually inflicted it. His calm, polite demeanor throughout the hijacking, tipping flight attendants, ordering a drink, expressing genuine concern for passenger safety, created an oddly sympathetic portrait, entirely at odds with typical criminal behavior. Annual festivals celebrating Cooper Day still occur in towns near his suspected jump zone. Souvenir shops sell Cooper-themed merchandise. In a strange twist of American culture, this anonymous felon became something closer to a folk hero than a wanted criminal. This cultural sympathy raises an uncomfortable but fascinating question. Why do Americans romanticize a crime that, by any objective measure, terrified 36 innocent passengers and crew members? Perhaps it's the audacity, the sheer improbability of pulling off something so daring and disappearing so completely. Perhaps it reflects a deeper cultural fascination with reinvention, the uniquely American fantasy of shedding an old identity entirely and vanishing into a new life unburdened by the past. Cooper, whoever he truly was, tapped directly into that fantasy, becoming a blank canvas onto which an entire nation projected its own complicated feelings about freedom, escape, and consequence-free reinvention. Investigators have also examined the psychological profile suggested by Cooper's calculated behavior throughout the hijacking. His demands were specific, but not excessive. precisely calibrated to seem reasonable enough that authorities would comply quickly rather than negotiate extensively. His courteous treatment of hostages suggested someone who had carefully planned his crime as a controlled operation, not an impulsive act of desperation. Forensic psychologists studying the case note that this level of preparation, combined with his apparent technical aviation knowledge, suggests a methodical, patient personality, someone capable of planning meticulously over an extended period, then executing that plan calmly under enormous, life-threatening pressure without any visible panic.
Yet that same meticulous planning makes his final, fatal-seeming decision even more puzzling. Why would someone so careful choose to jump at night into a violent storm over unfamiliar mountainous wilderness wearing entirely inappropriate clothing for a wilderness landing or survival scenario? Some researchers theorize Cooper simply hadn't anticipated how severe the weather would become by the time he actually jumped, having planned his escape based on earlier, calmer conditions before the storm intensified. Others suggest he may have deliberately accepted enormous personal risk, calculating that even a small chance of survival and escape outweighed the absolute certainty of capture and lengthy imprisonment if he remained aboard the aircraft.
Weather data from that November night reveals just how dangerous conditions truly were. Temperatures at the altitude Cooper jumped from hovered near freezing, with winds reportedly gusting well over 100 miles per hour as his parachute deployed into the raging storm. Visibility was near zero. Rain fell in sideways, punishing sheets driven by fierce mountain winds. Even an experienced, well-equipped skydiver would have faced tremendous danger under these specific conditions. For a man wearing loafers and a business suit, carrying an untested parachute, jumping into that particular storm wasn't simply risky. Many aviation experts consider it close to suicidal, regardless of his underlying technical knowledge or confidence. Given these brutal conditions, why has no trace of Cooper's remains ever been found, despite decades of searching across an admittedly vast wilderness? Some researchers point to the sheer scale and remoteness of the terrain. Dense, old-growth forest, steep, unmapped ravines, and areas so thick with vegetation that ground search teams struggled simply to walk in a straight line. A body, once obscured by fallen branches, thick undergrowth, or buried under decades of forest debris, could realistically remain undiscovered indefinitely. Animal scavengers, natural decomposition, and the sheer passage of time could easily eliminate most identifiable physical evidence within just a few years of an unwitnessed wilderness death. Others argue precisely the opposite. The very absence of any remains, despite such an extensive, sustained, multi-decade search effort, actually supports the theory that Cooper survived. Proponents of this view note that human remains, particularly from someone wearing distinctive clothing and carrying identifiable equipment, tend to eventually surface through hunters, hikers, loggers, or future construction projects, disturbing previously undisturbed terrain. The complete absence of any confirmed discovery, they argue, over more than 5 decades of intensive searching by professionals and dedicated amateurs alike, suggests Cooper simply wasn't there to be found, because he had genuinely, improbably, successfully survived his own audacious escape plan. If Cooper did survive, what kind of life might he have built afterward? Researchers who favor the survival theory imagine a man forced into permanent secrecy, unable to ever fully spend his stolen fortune without risking exposure, unable to maintain relationships built on genuine trust, unable to ever again speak openly about the single most extraordinary night of his entire life. It's a haunting kind of freedom, successfully escaping capture, perhaps even living for decades afterward, yet permanently trapped by his own secret, forced to carry the enormous weight of his crime silently, alone, for the remainder of whatever life he managed to build under an assumed and carefully protected identity. The case has also inspired genuine scientific innovation in forensic investigation. Advanced particle analysis techniques, developed specifically to examine Cooper's discarded tie, have since been applied to other cold cases entirely unrelated to aviation crime. DNA extraction methods, refined during Cooper-related research, contributed meaningfully to broader forensic science, improving investigators' ability to recover genetic material from decades-old physical evidence in cases nationwide. In a strange, unintended way, this single unsolved hijacking has quietly influenced criminal investigation techniques used across the entire country, proving that even history's most frustrating unsolved mysteries can still generate meaningful, lasting contributions to how modern investigators approach seemingly impossible cold cases.
Aviation security itself transformed dramatically in the years following Cooper's hijacking, largely because of the very vulnerabilities his crime exposed so publicly. Within a year, airlines began implementing mandatory passenger screening procedures, early forms of the metal detectors and security checkpoints, now considered a routine, unavoidable part of modern air travel. Boeing eventually modified the 727's design itself, installing an external mechanism preventing the rear stairway from being lowered during flight, a modification aviation engineers still informally call the Cooper vein, in recognition of the very crime that inspired its creation. Few criminals in American history can claim they permanently reshaped an entire industry's fundamental safety infrastructure.
This lasting impact adds another layer to Cooper's strange cultural legacy. He wasn't simply a criminal who briefly captured headlines before fading into obscurity. His single act directly reshaped how millions of people experience air travel every single day, from the security checkpoints travelers now consider routine to structural modifications built directly into modern aircraft design. In some strange, unintentional way, D.B. Cooper's audacious escape made air travel measurably safer for everyone who followed him, even as his own ultimate fate remained permanently, frustratingly unknown to the very investigators and security experts whose careers his crime had fundamentally, unexpectedly transformed unexpectedly. Despite the FBI's official 2016 withdrawal from active investigation, independent researchers, historians, and true crime enthusiasts continue pursuing new leads even today. Advances in forensic genealogy, the same cutting-edge technique that helped identify other infamous cold case criminals decades after their crimes, offer renewed hope that partial DNA evidence recovered from Cooper's tie might eventually be matched against genetic databases increasingly populated through consumer ancestry testing services. Every year, new tips arrive, some credible, most ultimately disappointing, each one reigniting brief hope that this half-century-old mystery might finally, definitively be solved through modern scientific techniques the original 1971 investigators could never have imagined possible. The families of long-deceased suspects continue to grapple with uncertainty, too. Several relatives who once passionately believed a father, brother, or husband had secretly been D.B. Cooper have since watched DNA testing eliminate their loved one from serious consideration, forcing them to reconcile cherished family suspicions with disappointing scientific reality. Others still maintain unwavering belief, despite inconclusive evidence, pointing towards circumstantial details, unexplained behavior, or deathbed confessions that science alone cannot fully explain or dismiss. For these families, Cooper's case isn't simply an abstract historical curiosity. It's deeply personal, tangled directly into their own family history, identity, and unresolved private mysteries. What makes this case endure isn't merely the unsolved crime itself, but everything it represents about the limits of even modern investigative capability. Despite fingerprint analysis, DNA testing, forensic particle examination, geographic profiling, and thousands of hours invested by dedicated federal agents and passionate amateur researchers alike, one man successfully vanished so completely that basic questions, his true name, his fate, whether he lived or died that stormy November night, remain genuinely, entirely unknown. In an era when nearly everything about anyone can seemingly be discovered through enough determined investigation, D.B. Cooper stands as a rare, humbling reminder that some mysteries can still, remarkably, resist even our most sophisticated modern tools. Consider, too, the strange psychological weight this uncertainty places on everyone connected to the case. Investigators who dedicated entire careers to solving it retired without ever learning the truth. Witnesses who once sat beside Cooper on that fateful flight lived out their remaining decades never knowing whether the calm, polite stranger they briefly encountered had survived or perished. Even Cooper's chosen alias itself, borrowed from a French comic book character entirely unrelated to the actual hijacking, remains a small, strange mystery of its own, a deliberate misdirection from a man who seemingly planned every single detail of his crime with remarkable, unsettling precision and foresight. Perhaps most remarkably, Cooper's case represents something genuinely unique in American criminal history. A mystery with no confirmed victim beyond an airline's financial loss, no confirmed perpetrator despite hundreds of investigated suspects, and no confirmed resolution despite nearly 50 years of dedicated, well-funded investigation. It exists in a permanent state of unresolved tension, simultaneously a documented historical event witnessed by dozens of people, and an almost mythological blank space where facts simply run out. Few crimes in American history occupy that strange liminal territory quite so completely, refusing every attempt at closure, regardless of how much time, money, or genuine investigative brilliance has been directed toward finally solving it. Somewhere, perhaps, an elderly man once lived out his final years in quiet anonymity, having successfully carried the greatest secret in American criminal history to his grave without a single soul ever suspecting his extraordinary past. Or perhaps his remains still lie hidden beneath decades of forest undergrowth in the remote wilderness of southwestern Washington, undiscovered simply because the terrain itself remains vast, unforgiving, and largely unexplored even now. Both possibilities remain equally credible. Both possibilities remain entirely unproven. And that fundamental, irreducible uncertainty is precisely what has kept this single, audacious hijacking alive in America's cultural imagination for more than 5 decades. The D.B. Cooper case ultimately reveals something profound about American identity itself, our persistent fascination with reinvention, our complicated relationship with authority, and our genuine admiration for audacious, meticulously executed plans, regardless of their fundamentally criminal nature. Cooper committed a serious federal crime, threatening innocent passengers and stealing an enormous sum of money. Yet he did so with a calm, almost theatrical precision that transformed him in the American imagination from simple criminal into something closer to legend. His story endures not despite its unresolved nature, but precisely because of it, a genuine mystery in an age when very few mysteries manage to remain truly, permanently unsolved. Today, the FBI's physical case file remains preserved, its evidence carefully cataloged, available for review by researchers, and occasionally revisited when a promising new lead emerges. The recovered ransom money sits in an evidence vault, its serial numbers still matched against the original 1971 records. Cooper's discarded tie remains preserved for potential future forensic analysis, waiting for scientific techniques not yet invented to finally extract whatever final secrets its fibers still silently hold. Every piece of physical evidence connected to this case has been preserved with extraordinary care, waiting patiently for the day, if that day ever truly comes, when someone finally identifies the man who vanished into that storm.
Perhaps D.B. Cooper's greatest legacy isn't the crime itself, but what his permanent disappearance reveals about the boundary between history and myth. We live in an age of surveillance cameras, DNA databases, and digital footprints that make true anonymity almost impossible to achieve. Yet one calm, unremarkable man in a business suit managed to step through a storm and disappear so completely that 50 years of investigation couldn't drag him back into the light. Somewhere between that empty airplane seat and the dark forest below, an ordinary stranger
became something America rarely produces anymore, a genuine, unsolved mystery, forever suspended between the last moment he was seen and whatever became of him afterward. If you are a hunter, subscribe and join the hunt. Before you go, thank you for staying until the very end. In a world of endless scrolling and short attention spans, you chose to spend this time exploring real human stories. That means more than you know. If these stories moved you, made you think, or helped you see the world a little differently, please subscribe and turn on notifications. It's the best way to support this channel and make sure more stories like these continue to be told. And if one of these stories stayed with you after the video ended, share it with someone you care about. One message, one repost can help these voices reach someone who needs to hear them. Leave a comment and tell me which story touched you the most. I read every one. Thank you for your time, your curiosity, and your heart. I'll see you in the next story. If you are a hunter, subscribe and join the hunt.